Hello, I'm Kai Rosga, and welcome to Version Up, one lawyer's journey to digitally transform his legal practice. Is one AI tool better than another? Is a specialized tool better than a general purpose one? These are fundamental questions that should inform every decision about whether to buy, what to buy, and how to calculate ROI when selecting a legal technology solution. Yet, if we're honest, we would admit that we aren't asking the question. And for those that do, the industry is not prepared to answer it. Into this void steps Legal Benchmarks, a project by Anna Guo and Elgar Weijtmans, who have collaborated to develop a framework for evaluating AI tools across various dimensions. The goal is transparency, and the payoff is not just for the buyers of LegalTech. The vendors stand to benefit as well, as better performing tools can compete on a more level playing field with the better funded ones. It's a compelling solution to an acute problem facing the legal technology space. I hope you enjoy our discussion about it on this episode. Elgar and Anna, welcome to Version Up.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here.
Excited to be chatting with you.
This is, well, as you can tell, this is my first three-way podcast recording so far. So this will be interesting. You're both on here because you have collaborated on a really interesting project surrounding benchmarking legal tech tools or AI. But before we dive into the nitty and gritty of that, I would love for you to just explain to me who you are and how you found each other and came up with this idea.
So my name is Anna, and currently I'm a lawyer based in Singapore. And my background is in private practice. So I started out in New York City before I moved to Singapore. Before I decided I didn't really like private practice, and then went and built a company, and then went in-house again before I saw AI was going to change the legal profession. And so I started benchmarking AI tools and published 2 reports last year together with the legal community that are all exploring how AI is going to change the legal profession. And little did I know, somewhere else in the world, in the Netherlands, someone called Elgar was also doing the same for his law firm. And he also published his own article on this, and maybe Elgar can share a little bit. And so our paths crossed ultimately at the end of 2025. And we decided that we would pull together our learnings from benchmarking AI solutions within the legal space and come up with a community-sourced framework that helps other legal teams going through exactly this process to navigate the selection and adoption of AI tools themselves. So there's a TLDR version of where I started, how we met. I don't know, Elgar, what about you? What do you have to add to this?
Well, it's hard to beat this, but just a little bit, I think about my background. I have a dual background, both in software engineering and in law. So I started off as a software engineer and basically stumbled my way into law during my career. I've been an IT lawyer for a big law firm in Europe, and I studied also law in New York City. And the last 2.5 years, I've mainly focused on benchmarking legal AI solutions, or basically benchmarking AI solutions for the legal market. And I convinced our law firm, H3G Law, who is connected to EY, to basically share everything that we found during that process. So from a software engineering background, it's quite normal to share your experiences and the struggles and everything you go through. But when I entered the legal space, I quickly noticed that everybody is quite protective of their learnings and their information and guarding that heavily. And so what I tried to do is convince our board and our partnership to allow me to share my experience in this industry. And luckily they agreed. So I started writing about our process of evaluating around 40, 50 different legal AI solutions in the market in order for us to select one that works for our firm. And what I noticed is that there was very little guidance or information available at that time. So we had to basically invent the wheel ourselves in that entire process. And at the end of the process, I documented all of that and wrote an article about that. And by that time, Anna already started Legal Benchmarks. So I refer to Legal Benchmarks as a great example of a similar initiative. And so that's how we basically found each other and said, let's collaborate and see how we can combine these insights. And that's, I think, what was the starting point of the legal AI framework that we have just published.
This is such a legal tech story already. I mean, it's international. We've got legal practice, we've got research, we have software engineering, everything's in the soup. This is a very common thing I hear when I'm talking to the origin stories for these ideas and really legal tech more generally. Exciting time where a lot of people are connecting from all over the place and from different backgrounds to come up with some interesting ideas. I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, which is this sort of how law firms can be a little hesitant to share. They can be a little guarded. I completely agree. I can tell you in the US law firm market is the exact same thing. Is that one of the hurdles that exists and that you're sort of thinking about how benchmarking can overcome? It strikes me that that's actually one of the barriers that's being overcome by doing benchmarking is overcoming this sort of complete lack of transparency among lawyers about what they're using and if it's working or not.
Yeah. And I think it will take a while for everyone to realize that if we do this together, let's say we raise the base level for everyone, not just for some. And I think what made the difference was when I explained to our partnership that our magic isn't in our theoretical knowledge, but in our day-to-day practice. And that's really hard to replicate. And as soon as you understand that, it opens up a whole world of possibility of sharing the theoretical side of things. And what we've seen from our perspective, from the legal benchmark side, is there's an impressive amount of willingness from all kinds of legal professionals to join these initiatives, but they first need to break out of their, let's say, day-to-day practice, realizing that the things that we are doing are not basically competing with what they are doing, but helping everyone. And I think what everyone needs is a first example of how this works. And now my hope is that now that we have a tangible, practical example of a very large-scale open source initiative in this sector, it will also pave the way for other initiatives like ours.
Open source is a great word to use because I think open source is almost antithetical to how lawyers at law firms are taught to operate. You know, I say that from a decade of private practice at law firms, but it seems like open source is often the key formula to how new technology grows, how user adoption takes off. Sure, sometimes those things turn into closed ecosystems, right? We have plenty of examples, but often the early stage is open source. Anna, does that click for you? Is that kind of part of the thinking of how benchmarks for AI tools can help catapult adoption, usage, and just sort of the trend line we're seeing in general?
Yeah, for sure. And I think especially in the climate that we are in, navigating AI technology and how it will impact knowledge workers, it's especially important to pull together knowledge and resources because, first of all, no one is an expert. No one can claim that they're an expert in AI for, I don't know, many years. It's because it's so new and it's not like any other previous software that only automates, let's say, very boring work or is very deterministic in its outputs. I think AI is different in the sense that it has such strong reasoning capabilities that are so scalable in a sense that it threatens in many ways so many different knowledge work domains. So there's a huge knowledge gap there in understanding this technology, both in what it's capable of doing and also the weaknesses and the edge cases of these systems, that if you don't pull together resources, then it's just impossible to keep up with what's going on. And similar to the conversation we had earlier, which is if you don't understand and everyone's in their silos, what happens is all of the education then becomes vendor-led. And you know when all of these vendors come at you with like teaching you about AI, of course, you are learning, and I think they contributed a lot. But there are incentives that they're trying to further, and so I don't think that it's sufficient just to have these vendor-led initiatives, and that's why we're also pushing to have these buyer-led narratives have a time on the stage as well.
That's a great framing of the challenge we have. Let's talk about legal benchmarks, explore exactly how it's helping lawyers have a more sort of buyer-led approach. Can you walk me through how it works and how you think it takes on that challenge?
Yeah, so there's two components to what legal benchmarks does. The first one is we are actually benchmarking AI performance in tests for legal specific tasks. So those are the two reports that I mentioned we published last year. So those tests give, I think, the entire legal community a clear picture. At that time, the tests were performed, obviously, because AI is capabilities evolving so quickly. It's a stamp in time, performance, understanding of what are AI's capabilities and what are their weaknesses, so you can understand how to use them under well-informed knowledge. So I'll give you an example of what are some of the findings that are relevant for lawyers. One of the very common beliefs at the time in 2025, and that you hear a lot from the vendors, is that you need to buy purpose-built tools, or you need to buy these legal-specific AI tools because they're more accurate, because they're trained on proprietary data, and because in the early days, some even say they have their own proprietary models that they trained on, I don't know, millions of contract documents, and therefore it's more accurate. But guess what our findings were? And this is also validated by Dow study, which had similar findings, which is that legal-specific tools were not always more accurate than general-purpose models. And that was a big shock. Yeah. And that was a big shock to a lot of people to say, I like that, purpose-built tools didn't necessarily outperform general-purpose model. And the second one was, we also found that the vendors with the most funding did not necessarily have the most accurate or the most useful results. So that's another it's probably appropriate. So all of these, I think, findings are the ones where these benchmarks are really important for buyers and for lawyers in general to understand the landscape and not be completely misled by marketing. And so that fast track to what Elgar and I built in terms of the framework for legal AI evaluations, I think that is incredibly important because it consolidates hundreds of legal professionals who were early adopters of these tools, who have their successes, who had their failures, their regrets, all come together, pull together what they know into this framework that will then be able to be utilized by legal teams around the world to do their own structured evaluation so that they have a process they can follow and make defensible procurement decisions rather than just being led by these, what a GC is now calling by procurement. And so that is a very long way of answering your question. And Elgar, please, if you have anything to add.
No, I to iterate that we had the exact same problem on our end. So before we discovered legal benchmarks, we went through this Vibe procurement process on our end, and we were lucky to have actual engineers do some of the work. And we had quite a large legal team, but it's still so much work. And the more that you learn about that process, the more that you realize how much you don't know. So it's so important to bring all that knowledge together. And so what you see in this AI evaluation framework is that we brought in people from an IT background in legal and procurement and privacy and from all different continents. And I must say, if we would have had this at the beginning of our process, I don't think we would have chosen a different solution, but would have definitely had a much better process to get to that point. And one of the interesting findings that we haven't published yet is that we asked everyone that contributed to this framework what their current status is with their legal environment. Did they choose a solution, and what was the process like? And I think one of the more interesting questions is, are they happy with the current solution, or are they considering switching? And I think the majority answered that question by saying they're considering switching. So that also emphasizes how important it is to have a good procurement process in order to end up with something that actually solves the problem you're trying to solve.
I actually have the number. I think it's 12% of the legal teams that have already deployed an AI tool are happy and satisfied with their current choice. The rest 88% are all looking and exploring at alternatives, which is shocking.
I guess that's also a big market opportunity for people who are looking to offer new products and solutions. From my experience, when I think about technology in my practice, I'm always benchmarking it against out-of-the-box general purpose LLM tools. And so for me, it's been mostly 365, at least in the work context. We're on the 365 suite, so we have Copilot, et cetera. I'm always thinking about is how much are we adding in value to that, right? That's always like kind of an internal benchmark that I use, but there's no rigor to it, right? It is kind of gutsy feeling. It's better than nothing. It's better than just trying a new tool and feeling good about it and going with it. I do try to somehow kind of compare it to something that we already have, but it's not methodical, right? It's not quantitative. So which tools or solutions are you benchmarking against? And how do you go about doing that?
So in the first two reports, we benchmarked legal AI solutions against general purpose solutions. And actually, Microsoft Copilot were in both of those studies. And I have to say, regrettably, that they didn't perform well in either. So it doesn't mean that all of the general purpose chatbots were superior compared to the legal AI solutions. So that's definitely not the case. And interesting enough, in the second report where we looked at contract drafting, we benchmarked the tools against humans as well, so human lawyers. And there are some interesting findings there that if you're interested, I can double tap into. But yeah, that's how we looked at those tools. And I wonder from Elgar's side of the world, he benchmarked more than 40 tools. And that's all legal AI or some general purpose as well.
Yeah. At H3G, what we try to do is benchmark what the delta is between generic LLMs and the specialized legal AI tools, just like Anna did. And we've had similar findings. And from the generic models, Claude was outperforming all the other ones by quite a large margin. And I think that's still the case. And one of the interesting findings that is similar to Anna's is that the delta between a general model and specialized legal AIs is usually very slim, and in some cases even negative. And so there are only a handful of solutions that really provide added value based on top of a generic model. And one thing that to keep in mind that's very important is just about, or I think all specialized legal AI solutions use the same LLMs under the hood. So everyone uses either Claude, ChatGPT, or Gemini. So what they add on top is basically context, so extra information that is injected into your prompt. And so it's the context engineering, sorry for the technical term, but it's the context engineering that makes the difference. And figuring out what they do behind the scenes really helps us understand if they're better than a regular model. And in most cases, the context engineering that is added on top of a general model is very slim. There's one use case, which is legal research, that I think is most interesting because that requires access to legal sources and reasoning and all these intricate legal thinking things that are required or are natural as a lawyer, but really hard for a model. And only a handful of solutions provided better results than a general model. And I think we're seeing that at the moment more and more now that, for example, Claude Cowork has come out with the Claude Legal plugin. More and more people are asking the question, do I actually need a legal AI, specialized legal AI solution, or do I need a generic model? And I think the honest answer is it really depends. But in some cases, you could argue just go for a generic model.
Wait, Elgar, I have a question for you. So you mentioned that some of the general purpose tools are better than the legal specific ones. How did you define better in your firm when you did the benchmarks?
So we focused on legal research, and what we did was basically create a very elaborate exam, like you would do with law students, and then try to cover all the practices or the specialties that we have within our firms, and then create cases that are both, some of them were real, some of them were synthetic, and then try to match the answers of the LLMs with the answers that we expect from a human. And that is very labor intensive, because one of the design choices that we made was we're not going to have an LLM as a judge. So we're not using an AI to judge the output of another AI. So we basically ran all these exams through all these tools and then figured out how close they got to, let's say, the ideal answer. And they're all creating it, like you, as you probably know, Anna, creating a benchmark is really hard, because figuring out what's right is much harder than figuring out what's wrong. So it's easy to throw a couple of curveballs at systems and then seeing if they can handle it or not. But it's much harder to ask it, let's say, run-of-the-mill questions and then benchmarking what the quality of that is. So it took us over a year and a half to get to a point where we had a usable benchmark, that in order to figure out anything meaningful. Does that
Mhm.
answer your question, Anna, or not really?
Yeah, no, I'm just super curious, okay, because I'm asking because, like, if you look at benchmarks right now in, like, across the board in different industries, every single benchmark has their own interpretation of how they are measuring the results and the output. And I think that's
Yeah.
very important for listeners to know, because even evaluations and benchmarks are in a very nascent stage of exploration, and there is no right or wrong or one way of doing it. And that's why understanding the nuance of each benchmark, what they're measuring, and what the limitations are is equally as important, if not important, not more important than understanding the results.
Yeah,
And
you're absolutely right. We have focused on a very specific use case, and this was an internal facing benchmark as well. That's also the reason why we haven't published it. We would love to publish it, but there are a number of reasons why we haven't. One is that we use actual cases, but the other is because this is so focused on what we think good looks like. It's really hard to generalize this for everyone. And the question that I've been asked time and time again is, which tool should I choose? And the real answer is, it depends. And you should figure out what your use case is and what you think good looks like. And I was really hesitant of sharing our results, because what I noticed is whenever I said this tool was the winner for us, people usually immediately assume it's also the right tool for them. And I think in a lot of cases, that's not really the case.
Mhm.
And so I have to admit, most benchmarks are basically, depending on the quality, a high quality vibe check and not really a very scientific project, because there are all these subjective design choices that you make along the way. And for us, that works because the design choices are focused on what works for us as a law firm. But you have or we now as legal benchmarks have a much harder job to do, because we have to create something that is easy to generalize for everyone. And that's why we publish it in different types of reports, because, for example, benchmarking for markups and contracts is very different than benchmarking for legal research.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the bias element, which is there's a lot of vendor sponsored reports out there.
Yes.
There's a lot of vendor sponsored benchmarking out there. And it gets very circular, right? It's sort of like AI eats
Yeah.
AI, and you're not quite sure what's coming out the other end. But I do want to drill down on sort of those design choices, Elgar, you mentioned, because it really jumps out at me when you're talking about this product that you cannot generalize and have a simple answer, right? It strikes me that that's very difficult to pull off when it comes to comparing the effectiveness of AI tools. How do you organize this for the user so that the user knows which benchmark to look to in order to make a decision that's well-informed?
Well, I think we do it in a number of different ways. To start with the last publication, which is the Legal AI Assessment Framework, although our initiative is called Legal Benchmarks, that's not really a benchmark. It's more a let's say, a vendor checklist, or let's say questions that you can ask a vendor and indications of answers that we think are good or red flags. So that's not really benchmarking, but helping everything around performance testing, because we think that's equally important to the process of selecting the right vendor. So asking questions about privacy and security, and if a tool covers your use cases. So that's really, let's say, the procurement process that is not really a benchmark. And then we have the other more research focused reports that are actual benchmarks, and those are separated into different use cases, like, for example, contract review. And we try to differentiate based on use cases. And one of the questions we got quite often in the process of creating that AI evaluation framework was, can we also create, let's say, a stage 0? So we have created in such a way that we have currently 3 stages. So it's the pre-demo stage, where you're just looking at the public documents and the website of different vendors. There's the demo stage, where you can ask questions during a demo. And then there's the more thorough pilot stage, where you can actually run some tests and ask more deeper questions to the different vendors. But before the first stage, there's maybe even a stage 0, where you as a potential buyer figure out which problems you want to solve, which use cases you have. And we're now figuring out how we should guide the people that rely on our materials through that process. Because I think that's one of the questions we got the most. How do we figure out which use cases we actually have? And we don't really have an answer to that question yet, but we have some initial ideas on how to tackle that. What are your thoughts about that, Anna?
Yeah, so just to add on what Elgar just said, we provide 2 sets of resources for the users or the lawyers in the community that visit the Legal Benchmark site. The first set of resources are actually the benchmarking reports. So those are the ones that show the rankings and the performance of these different AI tools in legal specific tasks. And we have 2 reports. The first report is on info extraction. So this is basically a very simple task of extracting effective date from a contract, for example. So this is one set of tasks you can look at the performance of these AI tools in. And then the second report covers contract drafting. So this is the second use case, I guess, for legal, which is drafting contracts. And we have not covered the other use cases yet. Like we know there is, for example, redlining, there is research, there is a whole host of litigation related use cases. So that is on the roadmap. And the second group of resources, which is what Elgar and I just worked on to release together with the rest of the community, is the Legal AI Evaluation Framework. So that framework and the tool sets that we released to the community doesn't tell the legal teams what the results are of the tools. It actually gives them the tool sets and enables them to benchmark these tools themselves. So they can find out for their own team, for their own specific use case, what are the best tools out there for them. So we don't give them the answer. We're giving them the tools for them to find that answer.
Yeah, there's obviously a short-term benefit here to helping users navigate a confusing space and make decisions about which tools to buy or not buy. But I'm also hearing over the longer term, some really interesting data that will come out of this. And I guess you could put your research hats back on, because I imagine over time, you're going to have some very interesting trends to follow about, for example, differences between vendor products. You might have 3 or 4 major vendors that are here 3 years from now. That's a big assumption, right? But let's say we have 3 or 4 core vendors for one of these problem sets that's here for 3 or 4 years. It'd be really interesting to have data that shows maybe the delta between them is flattening, right? And then that could feed into people's research around, okay, well, why is that happening? Is it that the technology has to do with it? Are we sort of seeing some plateau in the advancements of the underlying LLM? Whatever it might be. Have you thought about also that potential that you really might have some interesting data that people can rely on for understanding changes over time in these products?
So I can share first. I know. So the first two reports, I actually worked together with folks in the community on. So all of these are community source projects. And I really want to shout out to Arthur Salza Rodriguez, who was my co-author for the first report, and also Mohammed Al-Mamari. They were like legends, and they helped with the first two reports. And those reports have impacted hundreds of procurement decisions from the feedback that I've gotten from the community. And I know that they even shifted the product roadmaps of some of these vendors who participated. And additionally, I know that investors have now asked startups to participate in our benchmarks as a prerequisite for a 20 million funding round. So you are right that these benchmarks play an incredibly important role within the ecosystem. And I know as well, at that time, when Elgar published his benchmark based on their evaluation at HVG Law, that also had a huge impact. And
Yes.
maybe Elgar, you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is just an anecdote, but I had no contact with the vendor that came out as our preferred supplier at the time, at least not about publishing our article about it. And so by accident, I released that article at the time when all three founders were on holiday. And, and what I heard from the community is that and from them afterwards, is that by just publishing that one article, they were really, they got this tsunami of pilot requests and people wanting to test our solution, and actually a really large number of new customers. And I tried really hard to make this article that I wrote about it super nuanced and focusing on the process and not really on the outcome. But really, people rely so much on what you write. I learned afterwards is that although the vendor was really happy with the fact that I mentioned their name, they were also quite mad that I didn't coordinate the release of that article at that time. And I think that's a fun anecdote, but it's also signaling something bigger, and there's such a hunger or need for this type of information because it's so hard to get right. And it's like you mentioned, even harder to know who to trust and see who doesn't have, let's say, a commercial motivation to make things look better than they are. And what we're trying to do now is figure out how we can basically scale this initiative so we can actually provide some more quantitative information that also changes over time in order to help benchmark the entire market. So one of the ideas that we're working on right now is basically creating a repository with all the vendors that would like to participate and see if we can benchmark them against a certain, let's say, objective criteria. So you as a potential buyer don't have to do all of that work yourself. And we're still figuring out how we should position ourselves within that landscape because we want to be a very transparent, reliable partner. But as soon as you start working with vendors, there's also, let's say, other politics that come into play that we're still trying to figure out.
It's interesting. I hear how you are positioning yourself both to support users that are going out and acquiring tools and also thinking about whether they should maybe just stick to their existing general purpose tools or maybe they should build something internally. But then you're also helping solve a problem for the vendors, right? Which is, how do the vendors compete in the space and stand out and show their value add? Is that something that was part of the original business plan, or is that something you've conveniently walked into?
I think a bit of both, but go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to hear what you have to say, Elgar. But I'll share my perspective first. I think absolutely, because to be honest, and I think the vendors know this, a healthy amount of pressure is needed in order for the market to mature. And even though like these general purpose models improving so quickly with Claude Cowork, and I'm sure like, OpenAI probably cooking up something right now that's going to be released soon in the legal space. But like all of this just pushes these purpose-built tools to become a better version of themselves. And it's the same as the emergence of standards. I think that's a sign of gradual maturity in the market. And it will be painful in the beginning. I don't think that a lot of vendors right now want to be benchmarked or compared necessarily to meet any kind of standard. But in the long run, I think it benefits them in two very important ways. One is that they're able to raise their standards of either performance or security or all the other aspects that we have in the framework. And the second of all is also fast tracks their procurement process. Because if right now they go to each potential lead and that lead has their own internal evaluation process, they have to answer a whole set of different kinds of questionnaires and go through this different procurement cycles. Whereas if it was standardized and they know what's coming and what's expected of them, they can also better prepare for it, and they can also get pre-qualified lead based on these transparent disclosures. And it absolutely would benefit them both from a monetary angle and also from improving their product angle and also just building more trust with customers. So yeah, that's how I see it. Elgar, what about you?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I completely agree. But we also, I think, have to acknowledge that when we follow through on this idea, is that we will create a problem for them, because everyone is trying to differentiate so heavily with marketing and positioning and branding. And we're basically, by creating transparency, we're peeling away that layer of branding and identity and just focusing on the core of the product. And I think there are a number of products that are technically superior but have less powerful branding, and there are a number of products that have very well developed branding and a less powerful technology backend. And that will, I think, if we succeed, reshift that balance. So some of the vendors will be probably really happy about the solution or what we're doing, and others will be less happy. But overall, I think it's a win for at least the buyers, because we're hopefully raising the level of at least the technical capabilities of all the solutions. And so they are starting to compete on actual quality and not on branding. Because one of the things that we see, at least in the European legal tech space, is that a lot of buying decisions aren't really made on rational analysis. They're made on, do I know people at this vendor? Do I like them? How did they come across? What are our competitors using? What are the big names in the industry? And that's not necessarily the provider that works best for you. And what we're trying to do is help you figure out which vendor is best for your use case. And in the end, I think all vendors kind of get sick of answering the same questions for every different potential buyer. And that's a problem we can solve for them, I think. So we will definitely both create a problem for them and solve one. But overall, I think it will have a positive impact both on the buyers and the vendors.
Yeah, I could not agree with that more, in the sense that market transparency is so critical. As someone who can walk the sort of metaphorical halls of all the vendor products that exist out there, you start to quickly see a flattening of the features and capabilities. Everyone is LLM agnostic. Everyone is trying to be interoperable with all of your sort of main sources of data or workflows. And in the end, marketing seems to play an outsized role in what bubbles to the top or gets attention. And so anything that brings us closer to some sort of merits-based decision, I think, is a good thing.
Hey,
We've been
sorry,
talking, yeah.
I'm super curious because I know initially when you reached out to me, Kay, you mentioned that you went to Legal Week and you were like walking around all of those different vendor booths, and you felt like the whole world was a little bit fuzzy, like what they did. Can you share a little bit more with us, like what that experience was like? And for you, like on the buy side, or even as a user or as a potential buyer, what kind of clarity would you want to make this world a little bit less fuzzy?
I think that the main questions, and we've already, I think, addressed this, frankly, is that I want to understand what the delta is between a general purpose solution and one that is specialized. And I want to be able to also make a decision about whether it makes sense to buy anything at all, or whether it makes sense to build on top of whatever general purpose LLM I have already deployed in an enterprise level, whether that be 365 suite with ChatGPT, whether it be a cloud-based workspace, et cetera. And so I think we've spent a lot of time talking about how people are making that first decision and how you help address the lack of transparency and kind of comparing products general purpose. I would love to hear your thoughts on the vibe coding and the more internal build part of where we're seeing the market go, because it strikes me that in some way that's also a huge tailwind for what you're doing, in the sense that, again, the users are not just thinking about tool versus tool or general purpose versus specialized. They're also thinking, should I be investing in an ecosystem where I can build more of the solutions I need on my own internally? And I have to think that that's a tailwind for what you're doing in some way, but I was just curious if you thought about that from a market perspective.
Yeah, I'm thinking of answering this question from a geek perspective. So that might be very different from, let's say, the lawyer's point of view. But in my point of view, I think everyone in a knowledge profession or every knowledge worker will eventually be a builder in either a very lightweight version or a very heavyweight one. And we're also really seeing that with our power users who are building their own solutions, in our case, with Claude Code. But as a software engineer, I'm really scared of vibe coding because I'm building everything that I'm creating right now with Claude Code. And I think I'm currently writing 20% of the code by hand and 80% with AI. But I can actually, like a lawyer, fact check the output and see if anything is vulnerable or insecure or not, or the architecture does not make sense. So it's because I have the experience of writing code by hand, it's easier for me to verify the output. And it's basically the same process as a lawyer. If you're a trained lawyer, you know if an AI solution spits out crap. And I think what I'm seeing right now is the same as with the legal profession. Non-lawyers are starting to do legal work because AI enables them to do so. And so non-software engineers are building stuff because AI enables them to do so. And I think in the end, all these problems that I'm scared about right now, like security and infrastructure and architecture, will also be solved along the way with AI. And that leaves us at the point where I think everyone will be a builder, and it does no longer make sense to have a very specialized generic solution. I can even see a future where interfaces are generated real time. So you don't have purpose-built solutions. You just interact with an AI that creates the interface for you, depending on which problem you're trying to solve. This sounds a bit futuristic, but with the development of AI models at the moment, I think real-time code generation will be feasible quite soon. But getting back to the actual legal reality is most of that is already possible, not the real-time generation, but building your own solutions. And if you have some engineers, you can actually also make sure they're safe and secure. But what I'm seeing with lawyers is that they want something that just works out of the box. So even if Claude Code or Claude Cowork works better at most things lawyers do, they want a solution that is easy to use and integrates well and is friendly to the user. So one of the questions I don't know the answer of yet is, even though you have the possibility to be a builder, does everybody want to be a builder? I think everybody should want to be a builder, but I don't know if they want to be that. So I'm very curious of what you think about that, Anna.
I think a lot of lawyers are not inherently builders of software solution, even though the barrier for building has lowered incredibly. Most lawyers are hired to do lawyering related jobs. And I have a slightly different like idea of what the future knowledge worker profession will look like. Maybe it's just semantics in terms of wording. But I feel like most future knowledge workers are going to be reviewers and QAs doing a lot of QA work, not necessarily building work, if that makes any sense. It's like traditionally lawyers drafted contracts themselves and they wrote out each word, and then templates came along, and we all know that lawyers then started copy and pasting from templates, and then you kind of review and you tweak stuff based on the template language and based on your own like specific terms. And now what I'm seeing with AI is that we are now just reviewing. Like the AI is doing the generation of the content, and then we're just reviewing it for accuracy or for preference. And I think that will be the future more and more so. We will be supervisors, and we will be the ones that are overlooking the content that AI generates. But whether the lawyers will be builders, like we'll all be builders in the future, I actually don't think that will be the case. And then going to the question of internal builds, I've been speaking to legal teams that are very much at the front end of AI adoption or experimentation in the last year and a half. And thus far, I have not spoken to one team that has had a very successful internal AI build. And so I'm very curious if anybody is listening out there and they have like a very successful internal deployment of like their own AI builds, I would love to speak to them. And I don't know if it's the right time, but like maybe in the future I can share with you some of the reasons why those internal builds haven't quite worked out as expected. But yeah.
Yeah, let me try to do it both of you actually and pose a follow-up question. I think I agree that not every lawyer will build, but I also think every legal enterprise will build in some way. And maybe, Anna, maybe it's not always like an AI thing. Maybe it's something that AI from external tools builds on top of, but I think there will be probably a lot of legal build internally. And so if that's the case, let's just take that as a given that every legal enterprise will be building some level of capabilities internally. Let's even assume some of that will be, AI powered. If that's the case, will I be able to use legal benchmarks to compare my own tool's performance against something that can be purchased off the shelf? And if not, can I suggest that maybe you explore that?
We actually, I got requests like this before, but the request was, I want to benchmark my performance against off the shelf tool like Harvey or Lagora, but I don't want you to publish the results.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But the question's out there. That's interesting.
Yeah, and we're
It
seeing
is out there.
examples of
Yeah.
benchmarks that also publish their benchmarking data sets. So there, for example, OpenAI has released a knowledge work benchmark that also includes legal questions, and they published their what they call their gold set of questions and answers. Although it's a very limited data set, I would be very curious of doing something similar with legal benchmarks. But I wonder if individual vendors or buyers are able to run their benchmarks themselves. So even if we provide them with the data set, I wonder if they're able to run the actual benchmark. So it would probably require more than just releasing our test questions and answers or our matrix or whatever that we use. We should probably also release a pipeline that they can use, but that then also becomes quite technical. So that's a problem that we still need to solve, I think, Anna.
So maybe that's something to say for the consulting arm of this growing enterprise.
Yeah, it could very well be. And just to add to what we just discussed, one of the things that I don't see happening is enterprises building their own AIs. We've seen that with all the large corporations. Even within EY, we tried to build our own AI solution, and basically these are all glorified ChatGPT wrappers, and I think none of them have succeeded so far, with maybe an exception here and there. So what I see if everyone becomes a builder, let's say everyone becomes a builder and the people that don't will get fired. So in that way, everyone will become a builder anyway. They will build solutions that are not really, let's say, AI platforms, but more like basic or easy to use workflows that are enabled by AI. And we do that all the time within our law firm. So for example, we have a team that creates purpose-built software for very specific problems, and we can do that quite rapidly with AI. But we are fortunate enough to have actual engineers do that. And I could see that more enterprises would do the same.
I want to ask a follow-up about security, because this is another big thing that I know users, adopters of technology are constantly thinking about, especially legal enterprises, whether it's a law firm, whether it's a corporate legal department. Right now, I get the sense that the way that security is vetted is more of like a checklist, right? Every enterprise has its own idea of what the baseline should be, and they just ask, like, do you meet these requirements? Sometimes people might ask for like a white paper, and I assume they just run that through ChatGPT and maybe compare it against a checklist. I hope that's what they're doing. Is there a benchmarking alternative to that? Is there a path forward where benchmarking helps in comparing tools on security? Or am I thinking about it the wrong way? Is security more of like, look, there's just a baseline you have to get across, and once you get across it, that's all that matters?
So looking from our own perspective, for us, legal as a law firm, privacy and security is super important. And we are an EU-based law firm. So, for example, things like that our data doesn't leave the European Union is super important. And that's very hard because all the large language models and all these providers are US-based. So there are different ways to solve that problem, but not everybody uses the same methods for that. And what we did on our end was first look at all the documentation, all the security centers. We have security engineers that look at that. And with the vendor that we selected, we actually did a penetration test to verify if everything that they documented also is the case in real life. And that's where it gets really hard, because I think everyone, to a certain extent, has a data set that buyers can use to verify if it matches their risk appetite. But we've come across at least one vendor that's, for example, said that their data never leaves the European Union, but upon further inspection, we saw that they're using, for example, Azure's global deployment for AI models, and then they cannot guarantee that it doesn't leave the European Union. So I think as a buyer, it's doable if you have, especially if you have security engineers, to check what people are or what a vendor is saying and see if that matches your risk appetite. But actually verifying if it's truthful or not is the hardest part. And I don't know if that's something we can support with. One of the things that we are probably going to do is to see if we can at least have a structured self-declaration by the vendors. So at least we have everything in the same format, so it's easy to check and compare. And we might add an extra verification layer on top of that. But doing, for example, penetration tests or audits for every vendor is such a labor-intensive project that I think that would either be very far down the road or maybe not possible to do at all. What are your thoughts, Anna?
Yeah, I fully agree. And it was actually Elgar who first mentioned this to me, that just because a vendor has, for example, SOC 2 compliance, or they checked off the list of certain certifications, doesn't mean that you can just, if you were to do a rigorous evaluation, just say that satisfies the security related requirements. And actually, Elgar, didn't you even mention before that just because a vendor relies on certain certifications with regards to security, because they're using a certain like Microsoft environment or whatever it is, it doesn't mean that their own application actually satisfies that security standard, because
Yeah,
they're building on top of the layer of the infrastructure. I'm not technical enough to explain
no,
this,
but
but
this is a great point, and thank you for adding that. And so one of the things that we found is because everyone is a startup in this market, everyone is trying to get all the certifications, but it takes a while and it's quite capital intensive too. So the shortcut some of the vendors have made in the past, and maybe some of them are doing right now, is displaying, for example, ISO certification marks on their website, but not being ISO certified themselves, but having sub-processors that are ISO certified. So for example, Microsoft is definitely ISO certified or SOC 2 Type 2 certified, but that doesn't mean that everything the specialized vendors builds on top is also at the same privacy and security level. And so for me as a buyer, what I want to check is if the whole package has the same level of security and privacy. Because in security, everything is as secure as the weakest link. So you can have some very strong links in your network, but if one of them is very weak, the whole chain is weak. And so what you would want to look for is certification of the entire company and the tool itself, and not the underlying solutions. So you should be really careful when looking at these vendors, because some of them show these SOC certifications or ISO certifications, but upon closer inspection, it's actually Microsoft or one of their underlying sub-processors that are certified. And so the natural next question to that vendor should be, where's your certification?
I can tell that my easily distracted brain has taken us off the rails, because I think what I'm hearing is, look, there's going to be the need to compare features or certifications or capabilities between different products. I think there are already maybe some solutions out there for that. I think a LegalTech Hub, I think, is one that I think of, where you can kind of see what tools are out there and they try to compare them. What you're really focused on is performance, right? You want to really be able to provide people with insight into the performance of different tools and to compare them.
I think that's something we are exploring, but for sure, we want to bring a more objective lens and a more structured lens into looking at what are the most important factors that legal teams should care about, or they already do care about when they are comparing and looking at different AI solutions out there in market, and then trying to be able to surface those factors in a very trustworthy way to these buyers. I think it is the direction that we are going into explore more. But like this is very much a exploration, and if you have any feedback or thoughts on that, I'm totally open.
Yes, and I'm sorry that I bored you or you with the security side of things, Guy.
No, it's not boring at all. I think it's really the third rail. Well, actually, I think data is another one we didn't get a chance to talk about. But I think unpacking the data layer of a tech stack is just like a whole other topic. I think security and privacy is a whole separate topic. And then you have the performance, right? Which is what we focused on, which I think is great. We talked about the performance of products and how you can compare them, but all these factors are critical. So I think this is really interesting. The things that stand out are the need for market transparency, having apples to apples comparisons, rooting decisions in data, not just judgment, feely, gutsy things, having objective comparators as opposed to subjective decision making. All these to me are really great things to root a solution in. And it sounds like that's what you're doing. So thank you for helping move us in a direction where, as users or maybe as investors, as you mentioned earlier, as legal tech vendors, people are able to make better decisions, be able to differentiate themselves in the market, able to deploy capital in a more efficient way. I think all those can be benefited from your product.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. This was a really fun chat.
Yes, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.